And the act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
Hello and welcome to Voices from L5, a podcast all about space settlement. Today we're talking to Tom Murata, founder of This Orbital Life, a website all about space settlement. Hey Tom.
Hey Liam, how are you?
I am fantastic, thank you.
Great.
So why don't you tell all of our listeners who may not know what it is that you do?
Well, Liam, in my day job, I work for the U.S. federal government. I work for the State Department on International Relations. But I've always been passionate about space and space policy. I'm not a technical guy. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a rocket scientist. I focus more on liberal arts and, like I said, international relations. So I've always been interested in the more social side of space, and particularly space settlement. And so that's why I started This Orbital Life. I like to think of it as a venue to discuss not only the technical stuff. I mean, that's the sexy stuff, the big space colonies and the rockets and how to put all that stuff together. That's exciting, but also how to pay for it all. What are the legal implications of it? How to promote international cooperation when doing those things?
Right.
These sorts of questions. And so that's what we're trying to achieve with This Orbital Life. And I just have to say, I'm just so grateful to have the time with Voices from L5 and to be here with you today.
Well, and some people might not know because we're on a couple different, delivery methods here, but This Orbital Life actually also hosts Voices from L5, which we're also grateful and eternally thankful for.
Of course. Yes.
But we basically have a very similar goal, I think. This Orbital Life, as you said, focuses on the more anthropological side of space settlement. I think both of us experienced some frustration when we first were looking into space settlement about how deep the rabbit hole goes with the technical and engineering side of things, and how almost every topic you want to look up will eventually get overridden by that side of things. And I think we'd both be the first people to say that sort of stuff can be very interesting and
absolutely, and useful,
definitely. But it's not everything, and it's not very sexy, I think is the word you used. I don't think there's a lot of members of the average public out there who are going to get all that interested in space settlement by hearing about, orbital ratios and the latest launch to weight cost, equations.
Right. When I my first job out of college, I worked for a company called Liftport, and some of our listeners might be familiar with Liftport. They're a company that still exists today, and they're trying to build a space elevator. And a space elevator is exactly what it sounds like. It's a piece of infrastructure to allow, it's like a cable car to go into space, to lift objects. Instead of using a rocket to go into space, you'd basically climb up this cable to go into space. And it's a very challenging technical achievement, and they are not anywhere close to building this thing. Nobody is. It's very, very hard to do. But the founder of Liftport, my boss, a guy named Michael Lane, like I said, who's still going at it, trying to build that space elevator, he said, that the technical challenges, the real challenges of building a space elevator are not the technical ones. They are very difficult. Make no mistake. But the real hard challenges of building a space elevator will be legal, will be political, will be economic, how to pay for it, how to capitalize, what might be a $10 or $20 billion upfront investment for something that nobody's ever built before. There's always a lot of comparisons between space projects and, say, the Panama Canal or building the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, when the Transcontinental Railroad was built, railroads were a very established technology. Space elevators are not.
Right.
So you're asking investors to invest in something that is completely new. I mean, when you compare that to, the engineering problems, the engineering problems pale in comparison to that.
Right.
Who's going to give $20 billion to nobody to build something that's never been built before?
Mm-hmm.
That's tough. And then you discuss the political problems. You have, even with rockets, getting overfly rights and getting the rights to have capsules possibly, land or crash over a planet.
And you're talking about a thing that we've been doing for, nigh on 100 years at this point.
Yeah.
Like, we're coming on 100 years of rocketry in human development, and it's still a massive pain, a massive headache, legally and politically speaking, to launch one of these things. And SpaceX, I imagine, has to have a legion of lawyers somewhere that make sure that their projects work out, and I can't imagine that, it's easy for anyone. And when it's mind-boggling to me that the same questions that obviously are still very important to technology that is very well established right now, that we've been doing for a very long time, those questions aren't being asked about space settlement.
You mentioned SpaceX. I've been to the legal offices for SpaceX. I've chatted with those people there, and they do have lawyers. Of course, they have a legal staff, but they don't have a legion of lawyers.
Huh.
They don't have nearly as many lawyers as say, Boeing does. Now, that just might be a different business model, but I don't know Elon Musk, but I know he has said that he likes to keep the signal-to-noise ratio, in a preferable arrangement. And what that means is he wants to have more people, he wants to employ more people bending metal and generating revenue than not.
Right.
Lawyers don't generate revenue.
Right.
PR people, really, they don't generate revenue. It's the engineers, it's the rocket scientists that are generating revenue. So, yeah, they don't have as many lawyers as you think working on these issues. I also like to bring up planetary resources. New space is so exciting, but I fear that they're kind of running ahead of themselves, and planetary resources is a great example. They're going to mine asteroids. I fully believe that these guys are going to, at the very least, stake a claim on an asteroid soon. They're going to send some little gizmo, probably not much bigger than a CubeSat, and land it on an asteroid and say, this is ours. Everyone else go away. Mm-hmm. And what if somebody else says, no, that's mine, and they land their CubeSat on there?
Right.
Well,
and because we talk about how a lot of the technical side of this would hand-wave that away by saying, well, there's hundreds and millions of asteroids out there, you could have any other one, but the fact is that some of those asteroids are better than others.
Right.
Some of them will work way better than others will for the purposes of mining them, and it only follows that the first people to claim them would probably claim the better asteroids first.
Sure. I mean, if you, let's say Planetary Resources discovers a solid chunk of iridium, that's 10 meters in diameter. I'm not saying it's huge, it's not planet size, but a 10-meter diameter chunk of iridium, it's got to be worth billions of dollars.
Right.
Even assuming that the market crashes once it's returned to Earth, it's got to be worth hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. You're going to tell me you're going to tell me Boeing and Lockheed Martin and all these enormous companies, Rio Tinto, these big mining companies, are just going to stand by and let this teeny tiny outfit from Seattle do that uncontested?
Right.
I would find that highly dubious. So that's why Planetary Resources is, God bless them, they're trying to pass legislation, the Asteroids Act, to lay the groundwork for some sort of property rights regime in space. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I have not read anything about that law making any traction whatsoever. As far as I understand it, it's still in committee in the House. I don't think this new Congress has taken it up at all, or if they have, it hasn't gotten out of committee, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a great example. This asteroid mining is going to happen, and the legal regime, the legal framework governing that is not as developed as it probably ought to be. It certainly isn't as developed as earthbound mining.
Right.
So.
And that's just one of the many questions that you and I, This Orbital Life and Voices from L5, we want to try to answer.
Right.
And it's like we were saying, that it feels a lot like the human side, the more human social questions of space settlement haven't been answered just yet. And, it's clear, I think, to our audience here, just listening to this, that you are interested in answering these very real, solid, and hard questions about, the legalities and the political, intertwinings that come with this. And, I think that is a very interesting topic, and it obviously, with your background, that's what you would be interested in. And, in a lot of ways, I find that those questions, like you said, are more important questions than how exactly you would build a rocket to go to, the asteroids. Because we can build rockets that go to the asteroids. The technology and ideas and engineering mechanics for how to build space settlements, well, Werner von Braun came up with them. This is they're old ideas. I mean, a lot of people may not even know, but the Bernal sphere, one of the early, more basic ideas of space settlement that is still proposed as a place for humans to live in space, was made. The idea came about in the 1900s, like the early 1900s.
Right.
And, I think sometimes people expect technology to move along at a different pace than it really does, especially rocketry and, that sort of thing. We're still basically doing very similar things that we were doing, 50 years ago. It hasn't changed that much.
Right.
No, I'm not saying that nothing's changed at all. Very clearly not. We're obviously building bigger and better rockets now. But the fundamentals are the same. There's only so many ways you can mix chemicals to make a thing explode the way it sends it into the space.
I think the average man on the street would say the same thing. I'll simplify it even further. They'll say, look, we went to the moon in 1969.
Right.
What the hell have we done since then?
Right.
Why are we spending all this money on NASA if they can't get me to the moon?
And we'd say, hey, man on the street, we're not spending all that money on NASA. Stop complaining about it.
Right. Well, that kind of brings me to my next point about This Orbital Life and Voices from L5. I don't want to speak for Voices from L5, but for This Orbital Life, part of my mission with the website is to bring the concept of space settlement, not only to ask all these questions as we've been discussing, but to bring the concept of space settlement to those who are not aware of it.
Right.
I think when people think of, we're going to go live in space, they think we're going to go live on other planets.
Right.
Or on the moon in space, which is fine. I am totally in favor of that. I am agnostic. If the president said and Congress agreed that we're going to spend $100 billion and go build a colony on the moon or on Mars, I'd be the first one to be like, heck yes, let's do it. But the more nuanced and lesser known concept of orbital space settlement, I think is lesser known, and by the way, is more flexible and probably more achievable and will result in a higher quality of life than a planetary space settlement.
Right.
But I'm preaching to the choir here, of course. So to make that argument, that's to the man on the street, to the random person looking at their Facebook feed and being like, oh, that's an interesting image of some sort of spacecraft. What is that? Let me click on that and find out about orbital space settlement.
Right, and that is exactly what This Orbital Life, Voices from L5, aims to do. And it was my opinion when I first started looking into, the online community of space settlement that it really just isn't talked about all that much. These other questions that I find personally more interesting. And that's why I try to talk to people, like yourself and like the other guests that I've had on the show who are, anthropologists and artists and people who with a different viewpoint that perhaps wouldn't get their points heard. And it's been an interesting ride being along with you, considering that we have the same sort of goals in mind.
Yeah, here.
Well, hopefully we haven't scared off all our listeners by talking about ourselves for 20 minutes and being so self-congratulatory we could probably go to the moon without giant inflated egos at this point. But you mentioned preaching to the choir a little bit earlier, and honestly, I think if the goal of this is to talk a little bit about space settlement, how we believe in it, I think spending another 5 minutes or so explaining exactly what an O'Neill cylinder is probably wouldn't be a bad idea if we have all these listeners that we're hoping are the general public.
Oh gosh, you didn't tell me there'd be a pop quiz. Alright.
Well, short summary, right?
Yeah.
In 1977, a man called Jared O'Neill published The High Frontier, within which he described a vision of the future where people lived in space in these huge colonies, and he also laid out plans and methods of dealing with...
And we should be clear, by colonies, you mean basically enormous space stations. You know, everyone knows the International Space Station, these kind of like small, cramped, tin can type things. You know, these colonies would be orders of magnitude bigger. There would be clouds inside them, towns inside them, farms inside these enormous structures in space. So, sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Even the smallest ones that he proposed were still somewhere in the order of 500 people. And he, you know, in this book, he described a whole bunch of roadmaps to doing this, and he described how you would deal with radiation and food and water and resources and even entertainment and that sort of thing. And his book, I think, is probably one of the things that inspires a lot of people to space settlement. You know, everyone I ever talk to about space settlement, more often than not, at some point in their lives read The High Frontier, and that was sort of the spark of what they were talking, like how they got interested in space settlement. And it was the same with me. And what I found in that book was that it wasn't necessarily the parts about the exact diameter of the glass that would protect you from radiation that interested me, but the parts in between where he talked about the social ramifications about the space structures that he was talking about, and about the effects on life on Earth and life inside these cylinders.
Right.
Those are what captured my imagination.
You know, space settlement and, well, science fiction often portrays space settlement and going out into space as some sort of either utopia or dystopia, right? It's either, you know, perfect, like, you know, in Star Trek on Earth, everyone, you know, has everything they could ever need, or it's some sort of crazy dystopia where, like, I don't know, aliens are eating people and it's just terrible.
Right.
In my mind, you know, space, it's neither, right?
Right.
I see space settlement as expanding the stage upon which the human drama plays out, right? Like everything that we have on Earth, the good, the bad, the tragic, the wonderful, you know, that can happen and should happen and ought to happen. The same freedoms and, you know, desires and war and happiness should continue in space, you know, in these space colonies. I'm not one that says, oh, you know, space colonies are going to be this, like, perfect society where everything's wonderful. No, you know, you'll have just as many opportunities and so just as many challenges in a space settlement as you would on Earth.
And I mean, it's not to say that space settlements won't solve some problems. You know, one of the main reasons that we like to advocate for this sort of thing is that space settlement, for instance, would make building structures in space a lot cheaper and easier and more accessible, which in turn might enable things like giant solar collectors and that sort of thing to alleviate some of the energy wars that we have. And at the time, O'Neill was talking about how space settlement could alleviate some of the food and overpopulation concerns that Earth was having at the time, which, you know, I found just interesting from an intellectual point of view that that's not really something we talk about, since we quote-unquote solved that problem with stuff like genetic engineering and that sort of thing.
Right.
But that's I suppose the quick breakdown of space settlement and why we care about it.
I just another thing. Sorry, as an aside, I've often thought about space settlement. Like, why pursue space settlement? And not in the terms of like, why should the U.S. government spend taxpayer money for space settlement, but like, why should humanity in general pursue space settlement? Well, I think it offers an option for communities to pursue a new way of life in a new frontier. Not unlike, the Pilgrims left Europe to go to the New World to pursue their own religious community without interference. The Mormons went, and these are all religious examples, but I can't think of a non-religious example, but, the Mormons went west and founded, Salt Lake City over there to pursue their own, society without interference. Well, what if, I don't know, a bunch of, guys like Burning Man, wanted to do their own society or something like that in space, or there was a group who wanted to get together and they said, look, we just want to do our own thing without being bothered. Well, space settlement offers a venue, a place to do that on a scale that's big enough to actually have a town, perhaps a city, and an economic model and an infrastructure base to support themselves in space. I mean, I know that sounds crazy. The average person listening to me right now is like, that is nuts. But the technical basis for that, we've had it for decades. We've had the technical basis for a long time. Mm-hmm. The legal and political framework to do that, is still shaky, as I mentioned earlier. But the way to build these structures is, think of it less as aerospace engineering and more in terms of like shipbuilding.
Right.
These are structures that will be forged and bolted together in space from resources derived from objects that are already in space. They're not going to be like built in a lab by guys in, wearing spacesuits and masks and stuff in a clean room. No, they're going to be like bolted together by, welders and pipe fitters and things of that nature.
It's interesting that you mentioned a sort of anarchist, model of living just now. I think that would be an interesting thing for a guest on the show. See if I can find a space anarchist.
I was just groping.
No, it's an interesting topic.
Community that might want to go out and form its own community without, there's the seasteading movement. There's a bunch of people who want to build large structures to float in international waters so they can do drugs without being sent to jail. Okay, whatever. I somebody might not be into it, but that's the kind of thing that that space settlement could enable.
There you go. You heard it here first. You heard it here first, everyone. Tom Murata wants to send everyone into space so he can do drugs legally. Thanks, Tom. You've been great. Peace out.
Well, yeah, not quite the same, but
it's
and other communities can utilize the same framework to go into space.
But that's another interesting point, is that I'm seeing, at least with some of the guests that I've been talking to, and I think in your line of work too, I'm meeting more and more people who are coming around to this idea that space is an interesting and vibrant world to be interested in the science world. And actually, in particular, space settlement is a thing that people are becoming slightly more interested in bit by bit. And we talked a little bit earlier when we were just sort of getting ready for the show about how this may be just us because we're deep in it at this point. We're part of the communities where we read the blogs and we have the Facebook, feeds. But on the other hand, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and one of the last guests we had on, Bettina Farage, the gallery owner in Montreal, mentioned that she's seeing more artists doing space-based and science-based artwork. And I think my personal take on this is that thanks to the internet and basically NASA getting getting their stuff together as far as PR is concerned, I think more people are exposed to the wonders and magical nature that is science, and especially space science. More people are being exposed to that every day than have ever been exposed to it. And I think that's having a real solid effect. And we're seeing more...
I agree. I would credit SpaceX. I mean...
You would, you capitalist.
But I mean, Elon Musk, for love him or hate him, the guy knows how to make a splash, right? The guy is like a rock star. And, you got kids with mohawks managing, $1 million rockets in mission control that's like slick and new, and it looks like a science fiction movie, and it's just cool. It is super cool. And Elon Musk has made space cool again.
Well, I like NASA, and you can't take
Of course,
that
I
away
like
from me.
NASA too. I like NASA too, but
you're right. You're totally correct.
It's both.
Yeah,
I think it's both. Right?
I agree, but I definitely see your point. I think Elon Musk and the new space movement has a lot, is responsible for a lot of what we're talking about here. And, when, just as a very recent example, when he talked about landing that rocket on that barge, everyone was excited for that. My non-science-y friends were talking about that and talking about how cool that was as a concept. There were people, waiting for the live streams and looking for videos of it as soon as it happened. It was almost Apollo-like in how excited people were. And that was him landing a rocket on a barge.
Right.
People are excited about this stuff. A lot of people. And what I noticed this recently was,
But
I watched
call it a barge. It was a drone ship.
which I'm sure he called it that because it sounds super cool.
No, it was just a barge.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. The PR thing. He made it cool,
I've noticed that when I think you're totally right. I've noticed NASA launches dozens of satellites and missions and stuff every year. I mean, they do a lot of stuff like that. They're always launching people to the ISS. But the minute SpaceX decided they were going to launch a satellite, every single news outlet gets a hold of it and talks about it, at least a little bit on their websites. How often do you see a post about the next astronaut crew going up to the ISS?
Yeah. I have to say, one area, or there are two areas where NASA still has its mojo, and that's with, telescopes, right? Long-range imagery, and the probes, the Mars probes. Whenever Mars probes lands, and another area that is starting to I'm seeing a lot of attention, especially from non-space people, at least in the Washington area and in government, is the Europa probe. Sending a probe to the moon around Jupiter that has a frozen ocean. Or more accurately, there are miles of ice, and then underneath that ice, there is very strong evidence that there's a liquid water ocean under there.
Right.
I mean, this is blowing a lot of people's minds. They're like, holy cow, there might actually be some sort of life under there. Many space scientists say it's the best chance we have of finding life in our solar system other than on Earth. So that's getting a lot of people's attention. So what I'm saying is, the big telescopes and the probes, the robotic probes, but the manned space is, it's not getting as much traction as SpaceX seems to get. You're right.
Well, and I mean, I would disagree in some ways with that, to be honest. I think that NASA has that all down totally. But I also think that it's very easy to forget things like, a lot of NASA funding goes towards stuff like getting Neil deGrasse Tyson to talk about space a lot. I mean, the guy loves science anyway in space and would talk about it for free, but, he has some NASA funding, and there's plenty of other of these sort of personalities that get, if not funded by NASA, then encouraged by and given, all sorts of exposure and help by them. And, you have things like, I think NASA knows how to do PR right, personally. Let me give an example. How many people watched the Chris Hadfield video of him singing Space Oddity?
Yeah, that was huge. You're right. That was huge.
And I think they do that. Part of I know a lot of people really love watching those videos from the ISS. Watching Chris Hadfield particularly, I think, was a fantastic choice for an astronaut. Not only because he's a very intelligent, very, wonderful man scientifically speaking, but also the man has really good personality and on-screen persona, and he knows how to entertain people. And I don't think that would have missed by NASA. I think that was totally planned.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to posit this. What if it's a function of launching?
Mm.
When NASA launches an American rocket, like when they launched they tested the Orion back in December. I mean, that was huge, and they nailed it. I mean, they nailed it. It was front page news for at least a day, if not 2 days. I mean, it was big news, and they just nailed it. SpaceX just launches more, and it's a new thing. It's a privately funded rocket. It's got this really great American story. It's got
a cool name.
It's got a cool name. Blah 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 blah. It's an entrepreneurial thing. But NASA has the heft of history behind it. When that launch pad is all lit up and the big clock is counting down and it's that beautiful Florida morning, man, that just gets your blood pumping. It makes the hair stand up on the back of your arm there. It gives you goosebumps. So, I would posit that if they launched as often as SpaceX, then they would help the space movement that much more.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Look, this is all academic. They're all pulling the same train, right?
Yeah.
It's all helping the same movement here. If this is a movement.
Let's hope.
But it's a fragile movement, wouldn't you say, Liam? I mean, it's kind of. It's there. We're talking about two organizations really. We're talking about the U.S. government, NASA, with civilian space. We haven't talked at all about defense space, but that's kind of sort of in a little cul-de-sac. And we're talking about SpaceX. There's a whole, excuse the pun, there's a whole galaxy of other players, but really those are the two big gorillas in the room.
Well, we're talking.
Fair to say?
I think it's somewhat fair to say. I think that we're talking about SpaceX and maybe two other companies that are doing the same sort of work that SpaceX is doing, but without perhaps the same sort of publicity. Right. Or launching quite as much, or launching quite as prolifically. I mean, we shouldn't play down the fact that we live in a time when you have a dozen or so companies that launch rockets to do actual stuff in space. That's preposterous to even mention. Imagine saying that to someone who lived in the 60s, that, it's not just NASA launching, not just the country, you can feasibly start your own rocket company right now in 2015. If you wanted to. It's not ridiculous to imagine.
Right. But all of those rocket companies, all of that revenue comes from either launching unmanned communication satellites or weather satellites or national security payloads, or they are astronauts being paid by governments to go up to the International Space Station or the Chinese space station. It's either governments sending people up, paying to send people up, or it's I don't know, Time Warner sending up satellites. Ultimately Time Warner sending up satellites, unmanned satellites. There's no, and the satellite thing, I tend to, that's a cul-de-sac, like I said. It'll always happen. It'll always go on. If manned space goes away, that'll always happen, and it'll always be in Earth orbit, and it's never going anywhere else. So, the real future of the space movement is in this government-funded manned space programs. And the whole new space thing, SpaceX and, the Boeing CST-100, all of those are all dependent on government funding as well. So it's sort of an adjunct of NASA. I find that to be a very fragile environment. And this is a big debate in the space community. A lot of people say, oh, human space is in disarray, and then others make the argument you made. No, man, this is a golden age. There are so many companies going. Well, but they're all dependent on U.S. government funding, which is dependent on the whims of Congress. No?
Right. And I mean, I would disagree to a certain extent that we are in disarray and that there is... I don't even know if I disagree, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement.
I don't know if I believe it. I'm just summarizing, the debate out there. Right?
But there is certainly history that shows that this movement can be fragile. If indeed there is currently, what we're basically beating around the bush and saying, if there's currently a sort of space renaissance that we're on the cusp of, where things are going to get exciting and people are going to start paying attention like they did back in the Apollo days, and funding might increase and so on. If we are indeed on the cusp of that, the thing is, the Apollo era went away. And also all the things that were being created and thought about during the Apollo era went away. And for some of our viewers may not know, but the space settlement movement is by no means a new thing. This first came about in the wake of the book that we mentioned, The High Frontier, in 1977, where the SSI and Wernher von Braun's space advocacy group sort of promoted the idea of living in space and took it to a Congress level and, tried to get bills passed and tried to get funding that would allow this as a concept to flourish in a similar way that some people were pushing for a Mars base. And then the bottom sort of fell out of that whole experience. People stopped paying all that much attention to Apollo. The Apollo missions got cut short, and people like Senator Proxmire went ahead and cut funding to a lot of these programs because they felt they were frivolous. Especially, if I could spend the whole episode ranting about how much I hate Senator Proxmire, I would be here doing it all day. But the fact is, you are right, space can be a very fragile thing. But I would also say, as a flip side to that, these days we rely on space as a resource more than I know we have ever relied on it. And space is now more than ever necessary for the way of life that many people in the West and all around the globe take for granted. With cell phones and the internet becoming more integrated day by day.
But all of that relies on technology that's unmanned.
Of course. And I wouldn't equate the unmanned satellites with manned space flights. And you're right, the unmanned stuff would continue.
That's the cul-de-sac I was talking about. You can go around and around and around the Earth, and it's not gonna go anywhere.
But what I'm saying is that I feel like because we have these technologies and these advances that we can point to and say, we have those because of space, and if we didn't go to space, you wouldn't have that phone. That phone would not work if we did not have the satellite.
Right.
I think that space is in a more solid position. Space science as a whole, including manned space technology, as a whole is in a stronger position for the place that we're in right now as a society, where we rely on space technology so much, in such a visual and visceral way. I think that we're in a bit more of a strong position for this, perhaps, upcoming renaissance in space. And I hope that extends to space settlement.
Well...
But you're doing something similar to this.
I was just about to mention that, many people may be under the misapprehension that part of NASA's mission is to pursue space settlement, that NASA's job is to build the sort of future we saw in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where there are moon bases and giant space cruisers going out to Jupiter and very elegant spinning space stations. No, in fact, nowhere in the law authorizing NASA's existence does it say that NASA should be working on space settlement. There are people working within NASA who think that their job is to build space settlements. That's not true.
Right.
That's really technically not true.
Now, there are one or two higher-ups in NASA who have went on record as saying that they believe that NASA's end goal is the settlement of space for humanity.
Well, I mean, the president has said that.
Sure.
But according to the law, the authorizations, the Space Acts and stuff, that create NASA, that allow NASA to continue functioning legally as a part of the U.S. government, that's not part of their mission.
Right.
So, it's kind of weird. It's kind of a strange situation. So,
and we bring that back to the statements at the beginning of the show, where that in and of itself is very much a legal political question, rather than a technical one.
Right.
But I mean,
absolutely, correct. Yes.
Before we got started, and I think that we should probably fit this in here, seeing as you opened it up. You are hopefully involved in a little project called MarchStorm.
Yeah.
That hopes to sort of change that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great segue from what we were discussing, how I feel that the space movement is in a fundamentally fragile position because it's completely reliant on the U.S. government. Well, there is a group of people who are hoping to essentially lobby the U.S. Congress to continue the support for space and NASA and, in fact, reinforce it and expand it. And it's a group organized by the Space Frontier Foundation, which is a space advocacy organization. And they're doing what's called MarchStorm. And you can check it out on marchstorm.com. And basically next month, in March, the Space Frontier Foundation has already scheduled a number of meetings with members of Congress to discuss 5 pieces of legislation or 5 goals that the Space Frontier Foundation would like to see passed into law. The first would establish settlement as an official purpose of NASA. It would authorize NASA to legally work on space settlement and space development.
And just to cut in there really quick, that was actually an objective of Gerard O'Neill's way back in the 70s and the NSS. But the Proxmire cuts actually went ahead and made it so NASA was not allowed to fund space settlement anymore. And this bill I presume they're proposing would presumably reverse that and allow NASA to research space settlement as a legal thing again.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't think the Space Frontier Foundation has an actual bill, and I don't think there's anyone in Congress. But they would, right.
They would be pushed for that sort of thing.
Push for a bill to be created that would include that sort of language. Yes, and I think that's an easy lift because I'm sure most constituents, most voters think, NASA should be working on that. Why isn't that already there?
Well, hopefully, and if they don't, that's our job to make them think that.
It's probably not controversial, or at least not as controversial as it once was. As an aside, I think this would be less controversial today than in the 70s because in the 70s, NASA was a completely publicly funded organization. In other words, this new way of funding space through the public-private partnership hadn't yet come into being. And so when Senator Proxmire or anybody in Congress said, we're going to fund space, it was through taxpayer funds.
Right.
But now the Congress can, and constituents can propose laws to do things in space that do not put the taxpayer completely on the hook. And that is the second thing that MarchStorm wants to do. They want to propose a prize to develop a reusable space plane. A real Buck Rogers, rocket that would go into space, drop some things off, drop some cargo off at the space station, and then fly back to Earth, and then the next day do it again. Just like an airliner. Mm-hmm. Back and forth into space.
Basically what the shuttle was supposed to be.
Exactly. But way cheaper and way safer and way more reliable, like an airliner, like a 737. They want to propose that Congress fund a prize to develop such a plane. And the prize would be as follows. The first organization to build a craft that goes into space, orbital space, and come back and do it again in 10 days would get $1 billion. The next group to do it would get $750 million. The third group to do it would get nothing. And that's the first half of the prize. Then the second tier would be the first group to do it 10 times, I believe in a month, or 10 times in a short amount of time, a relatively short amount of time. That's the second prize for $1 billion. And then the second group to do it 10 times in a month would get $750 million. So we're talking $3.5 billion. To put it in comparison, that's how much we spend on International Space Station operations in 1 year.
Right.
So for 1 year's expense for operating the space station, we get to get a real reusable space plane that could change the way we explore space. It could drop the cost of accessing space precipitously. It could enable the exploration of Mars within current budgetary constraints. Mm-hmm. It could enable total coverage of the Earth for satellite internet at a drastically reduced cost. I mean, there are plans now to do satellite internet globally covering the world with satellite internet, but it'll be expensive. It'll be $200 a month, to get that internet. I don't think they'll have much market penetration. But with this sort of reusable space plane, that could then become accessible to the developing world. Mm-hmm. There are 3 billion people without internet today. I don't think the global internet that SpaceX is trying to build will be cheap enough to penetrate, the developing world. But right. With a reusable space plane, they could. So anyway, it's a real world-changing technology, and that's something that March Storm is going to lobby Congress for. So
those were 3 points. What were the other two?
Well, those are two, and then there's a couple more that are a little more. One says don't over-regulate commercial human spaceflight, basically asking the FAA not to put excessive regulations on new space. The other one, there's a fourth one, is to advocate for full funding of commercial cargo and crew. Okay, fine, not really sexy. And then the last one that I think is kind of interesting is they're calling it promote a no-gap transition to commercial space stations. Basically what this means is they'll say they want to have the replacement to the ISS, to the International Space Station, in space and operating before the International Space Station is retired. It's scheduled currently to be retired in 2024. They could probably stretch that out to 2028. This group is advocating that a replacement, a commercial replacement, basically a commercial space station where NASA would rent space, just like the U.S. government rents space in a commercial office building on Earth. NASA would rent space in this commercial space station. They want such a facility in place before the year 2020. So that if something happens on the ISS and it has to be evacuated, there's a continuous presence in space with an American space station up there.
And I think we could talk for hours about how much I agree or disagree with some of those points, but I think the sentiment is something that I couldn't possibly argue with, and it's really exciting to hear that sort of thing is going on, especially next month.
Right. We could quibble about the details, mm-hmm. but the fact that, this is going to be a group of civilians. They're not professional lobbyists. It's just people who believe in space. They're actually doing something. Right? They're going to take action, and they're going to go to DC. I'm going to go there and try and talk to our legislators, our leaders, about something that is important to them, to enable a positive future for humankind. I think that's exciting, Yeah. Just even if it wasn't about space, just the fact that people are being engaged and getting active is really optimistic. It's really wonderful.
So what's the website they can go to before we finish up here?
The website is marchstorm.com. I'm not getting paid for this or anything like that. I'll also have a link to it on my website, on thisorbitallife.com.
They know where that is. They're on there already. That's where they're getting the show.
You don't know where you are. That's where you're at.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's marchstorm.com.
Just as a heads up there, no, he's not getting paid for it. Space Settlement does not pay.
That's right. This is all Pro bono.
That's right. Tom, you've been fantastic. It'd be great to have you on maybe after the March Storm, and we can hear a little bit how it went.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Anytime.
All right, great. Well, thank you for being part of the show.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. Take care now.
Take care.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to the show. If you have any comments, suggestions, or questions, please email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com. Music for Voices from L5 has been graciously provided by John Boswell of Symphony of Science. Find more of his work at www.symphonyofscience.com. Hey, if you like what we do here and you want to hear more experts from all sorts of fields talking about space settlement in ways that you might not hear anywhere else, consider donating to our Patreon account. We really rely on donations to keep the show going, and even a small donation helps us get better guests, better equipment, and produce a better show for you. We have some great goals in mind for the show, and we'd really like you to make something special. You can check out a link to our Patreon account on the website. Thanks.